It's always a pleasure to come here. It's always a pleasure to see you, Bruce. What I thought I'd do was talk about that. See, it'd be slightly embarrassing if I talked about something different. As Bruce mentioned, I brought out a book 2 years ago now, but it's just come out in paperback, on strategy. And one of the things that interested me a lot was on the overlap between classical thinking about strategy and radical and revolutionary groups. And what I thought I'd do today is talk a bit about what I would describe as sort of the classical model of strategy that influences a lot of the framework of rather standard military thinking. Point out that it influenced radical and revolutionary thinking as well, and then discuss some of the problems with it. The advantage of the framework is it allows us to talk questions about almost anything afterwards, so it opens up a wide conversation. But there's a process here of sorts, so bear with me while I go through that. So the interesting thing about our field is that it's one of the few where people, as a matter of course, go back to the classics. You wouldn't expect a business strategist to be desperately interested in theories that were developed in the 19th century, with the possible exception of Adam Smith, 18th century, of course. But it's obligatory in our field to talk at least about Clausewitz. People tend to forget about Germany, who was more influential in his time. But they were basically strategists of the Napoleonic Wars. They both were involved in the Napoleonic Wars, and they both developed their theories watching the great match in Napoleon. And their theories were built around the idea of the decisive battle. Clausewitz was slightly more cautious. He appreciated problems where it might not always work. But basically his ideal type, Max Weber's term, was the decisive battle. The idea behind the decisive battle was that essentially if you got the military operation right and you got the victory, which was clear, in those days the victory was clear, whoever dominated the battlefield at the end of the day, whoever was the least casualties, the most prisoners, or whatever, then political rewards would follow. The politics flowed from the military. Clausewitz tells us that the military took their objective from the politicians. That was continuation of politics by the military. Once that had been handed down, then the military should get on with it. And you see this to this day in the idea of an operational level of strategy, which is essentially a politics-free zone. It's the place where you don't want the politicians to interfere. There's a key moment in the after the 1870 war, when von Moltke, who probably the greatest strategist through his generation, was one of the greatest in the 19th century, but he'd beaten the French in battle and was frustrated that he hadn't yet got the peace that he thought he should have. And the issue was, what did they do about Paris? And Bismarck and von Moltke had a disagreement. Or Bismarck believed that as he was managing the overall politics, he should decide, and he was successful in this. And he was worried that allies would come in and support the French if they didn't get this war over quite quickly. That they had to bombard Paris and stop this nonsense of resistance. Von Moltke didn't want to do it that way, and he was overruled. And that was where the sort of dictum, the Prussian General Staff, the German General Staff held to thereafter, and the Russian Soviet General Staff and the American Joint Chiefs all held to thereafter, is actually, this is bad, politicians should leave us alone once they've told us what to do, and then we will hand them the victory. So it's based on the idea of the importance of battle. It's itself. Now, there were always problems with it, even in Napoleonic times. You could see the difficulty with the model. Problems with the model were, first, you may not get a decisive victory, just the military means may fail you, and you get stuck in a long war of attrition. Okay, that can happen, but you may still get the military victory. In the end, it's just you're a bit exhausted. You're not in as good shape as you expected to be. Secondly, popular resistance. Napoleon had experienced it in Spain. You can see it in the campaign with Clausewitz and Germany were both involved in Russia, the famous 1812 campaign, where the Napoleon's forces were harassed by partisans. And when they won the Battle of Borodino, but didn't win the war because there was sufficient left in reserve in the Russian army. And when they took the political capital, they found there was nobody there, and it was soon burning, and they had to go home. And third, alliances. Actually, if you look at the importance of the operational art compared to the alliances of operational art, which Germany would have won the Second World War. But in the end, it was the accumulation. So these very political factors actually decide war. So why wasn't more given in the 19th century to the importance of popular resistance, to militias, to irregulars? And it's clear that even the revolutionaries rather disdained them. Engels, Marx's collaborator, who thought himself something of a military specialist, just thought they were a mob. They weren't the advanced sections of the proletariat who were supposed to make the revolution. They were chaotic and a mob, and they didn't understand proper military discipline. The model of an insurrection that the Marxists used was very close to the decisive battle, and exactly the same features. There would be blows rained down on the forces of the government, and when they collapsed, then the revolutionary government would take over, essentially based on the French Revolution. So the idea of decisive battle influenced even revolutionary theory. And again, you could see in 1917 that's sort of what happened in Russia with the revolution. So the problems with the decisive battle idea were all well understood, but somehow there were these moments. And in the end, the Second World War ended as the First World War had ended with the surrender of the enemy army, and the political deals followed thereafter, as the theory said it would. So it's not surprising that these ideas have been very strong. And if you look even at the great figures of guerrilla warfare, as we now move into the post-Second World War period, there too you see the same ideas coming through. Look carefully at the theory of Mao Zedong, for example, and it's based on the idea of stages. Although he's described as a theorist of guerrilla warfare, Mao never thought guerrilla warfare would bring victory. What would bring victory was the third stage, in which you formed a proper army and overthrew the state. And that's what he did. And you can argue, if you look back at the great sort of radical and revolutionary campaigns, the anti-colonial campaigns, and so afterwards, even Cuba, Castro, that's how victory was secured. The forces of the state disintegrated, they were demoralized, and the army of the radicals went into the capital, paraded in their fatigues, and showed that they were now in charge. So it's a very, so my point is, it's a very strong model, and it takes you through not only from the classic forms of regular warfare, but into the area that we now have come to call irregular warfare. And if you think back to the partisan campaigns even in the Second World War, as well as these anti-colonial campaigns, by and large, the forces that were being faced were very disciplined. They had political control. Sometimes there was more than one political controller and they clashed with each other, but they had political control. So the still standard model of politics in command, which is of course a Marxist model, it's not just in the Western model of civil-military relations, the idea of the military needing to be kept under control is very much part of the Marxist model as well. So, which is why political commissars were all the way through the revolutionary forces. So what I want to suggest is actually, since that period, there's an important change in the nature of irregular warfare. You can, in a sense, as the problem becomes different from the problem of overthrowing a colonial power, or essentially a coup against an unpopular regime. When you start to see sort of the birth of radical movements in the 60s, say, sort of the new wave in the 60s, some of them certainly are influenced by the old models. The IRA, for example, whether it's the official IRA or the provisional, they have their quartermasters and their adjutant generals, and they fashioned themselves, they had battalions and so on. They part of the conceit was that they were a regular army. And that model within Irish terrorism was very strong. They called themselves armies. But then you look at the ideas where it's the Weathermen or the Angry Brigades or the Beider Meinhof and so on. They're thinking differently. They're more anarchic. It's more about sowing dissent and uncertainty within the society, the broader society. Or else, as with the Palestinian groups, they're about dramatizing the issues by hijackings and so on. But also, they're about asserting the political positions of particular groups. So if you look at the umbrella of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, there's a whole series of grouplets within that, all of which have got their own different sponsors and so on. So the politics of it is changing. The idea that victory would come through the defeat of the enemy in battle is less prominent. More prominent is the need to internationalize disputes, put pressure on oppressive regimes, undermine their confidence. If there's a model going back, it might be Bakunin and the propaganda of the Deal and the anarchists, but it goes beyond that. But it is geared to the media age. It is geared to the way that contemporary conflicts are recorded. So that's, I said, the first wave. Then I think when you think about what's happened with Islamist groups since, you've got another phenomenon, which is the extent to which, well, first, they have similar characteristics about dramatizing issues, propaganda of the deed, to use Freedman's term. But they also rely increasingly on self-improvement, not drawn from a population that's obviously under threat, but they get back to be part of it. But it's internationalized and it relies a lot on ideology. Or you have the development of warfare that is sort of reminiscent of partisan warfare, say in Bosnia, based on militias, where you start to see another phenomenon, which is the one that I think I want to focus on, which is, although they have the appearance of being armies, actually they're not that well disciplined, they're not that well organized, and the interests at stake for these groups may well be defeating, say in Bosnia, defeating the Muslims, or Croats, or whatever, but actually a lot of it is about looking after themselves. And the interface between crime and politics becomes of increasing importance. This is true, incidentally, also with the IRA towards the end. If you give people weapons, rely on them to finance themselves, by and large, they find crime's a good way of doing it. And when the politics is no longer so prominent, the crime tends to stay behind. And that's what happened in Ireland, even after the Good Friday Agreement. The interesting thing about this is it starts to tell you something about the problems of contemporary irregular warfare. Because instead of looking solely at the classical model of the political command, the army winning the decisive battle, what you're looking at is something much more fragmented, of groups, fragmented, often into warring parties against each other, they fight each other, but also developing particular interests in the conflict, which may relate to trafficking, to smuggling, to various forms of criminal activity. A state, to some extent, keeping the thing going, irrespective of whether peace negotiations are going on or not. Look at most African civil wars, this is a very strong phenomenon. Why do they keep on going? Because people develop a stake in the conflict itself. And the state itself is not strong enough, never strong enough to get a grip. The implications of this for strategies is that if to understand what's going on, you need to look at the micro level. The point is to stand back from the way that we discuss these things when we're talking about, say, ending the Syrian civil war. Talk about the Syrian civil wars of its three factions. But there's numerous factions. Each broad group is made up of coalitions that may or may not stick together, but have got their own particular interests, that are perfectly capable of moving from one side to the other if the balance of power shifts within the conflict. The attempt to find the person to negotiate with, the person who delivers, continually gets frustrated because you can't actually find that person. And if they claim to be that person, it normally turns out they're posers. This happened with attempts to get deals with the Taliban in Afghanistan, where you find somebody who claims to speak for the Taliban and they speak for a little bit of the Taliban, and as soon as they stop talking to you, they don't speak for the Taliban anymore. So it creates a real problem with contemporary conflict. Our models of how to, not only how to start it, but how to stop it, depend very much on an adversary who is organized more or less the same way as you are, with their own government and their own state, who, if they reach a deal, can discipline their armies and bring them to heel, to make sure that they follow orders. And so, you know, we may see ourselves fighting an Islamic state at the moment, but I doubt very much it's a state of that sort, because in the end, it will not have the internal discipline and organisation, even in this case, if there was any interest in the negotiation. So that was the sort of broad proposition I wanted to put before you. The challenge in the current day and age of trying to understand conflict and war within the same terms as we've traditionally understood it, and noting that the real change is not, particularly in the way we've seen, or we've always tried to fight our wars as if we could defeat an enemy through attrition or battle or a decisive battle. We've always tried to fight wars. What's changed is that the opponents don't think that way. That they have become increasingly loose collections of people with a general objective, but the way that they frame those objectives in more radical and ideological terms, and then the particular stakes they develop in the conflict, makes it much harder to bring it to a conclusion or even to have a definitive defeat. On that, I think I'll stop by half an hour and open up to questions about that or anything else. So, yep.
Okay, I'll start. It seems to me the most successful campaign against irregular warfare was Vietnam against the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Totally annihilated the Khmer Rouge. The Vietnamese had been masters of insurgency of irregular warfare. Defeated the French, defeated us, and then they demonstrated they could do the reverse with counterinsurgency, annihilating the Khmer Rouge. And I've always been curious, because I've never seen any studies of this. Are there any studies? What did the Vietnamese do against the Khmer Rouge that everybody else seems to have missed? Because we haven't been that successful.
Well, I mean, the point about the Khmer Rouge is they've been fighting their own people, killing them in large numbers. So they didn't exactly have a strong popular base by the time the Vietnamese started to move in. But secondly, I'm trying to recall it now, the leadership basically ran away from them, they went to China. Some states they went to China. And the Vietnamese also were pretty ruthless. And it's one of the myths of counterinsurgency that ruthlessness never gets you. Unfortunately, even the British campaign in Malaya, which was a classic hearts and minds campaign, it wasn't squeamish when it came to trying to kill the insurgents, and part of the hearts and minds message was that you're going to lose. That's the most important starting message of any good hearts and minds campaign is you're on the losing side. The reason why a lot of hearts and minds campaigns fail is because they think that by being nice and building hospitals and schools and so on, that wins over the population, which of course makes them well disposed. But if when you finished your construction work in the evening and you go home and at the night time the bad guys return, then you don't think you're going to put your faith in the good guys. So I think the ruthlessness and the fact that the Khmer Rouge had damaged themselves with their own population, been engaged in mass murder, they were weakened. They couldn't cope. And it goes back, to why did what the Germans might have been able to do when they invaded the Soviet Union, if they hadn't been rotten to the other side, and that would have the opposite effect because the mistreatment of the local population generated resistance. So it's not, there's two factors, it seems to me, that determine the success of these campaigns. One of them is just the general attitude of the local population. The second is whether you've got a government you can work with. And that attempts to find alternative governments often are fraudulent and fail. But if you've got a government you can work with, political leadership you can work with, and of course for the Vietnamese in Cambodia, that wasn't a big problem because it was an extension of communist leadership. Then you can succeed. Bruce.
So, confronted by this change, containment, decisive victory is completely off the table. Is containment the only reasonable strategy to pursue against the Islamic State or AQAP or the Taliban?
Well, you start to have to think so, don't you? I mean, it's very, what we found is that if you don't have a strong government, which I don't think is really a decisive thing, and therefore the local population is uncertain, these groups persist. And when you think you've swatted them away, they come back, and they come back in a different form. So we all thought, you know, when Saddam was killed and so on, well, that was the end of that. But it wasn't, because they mutate, and they still have roots in the society, and they're facing governments that are seen to be biased against their section of the population, in that case of Sunnis. So that, you know, if you've got Shia governments and Sunni populations, and the Shia governments act in a sectarian way, then these things happen. Or in Afghanistan, you've got a different problem with sort of warlords, and never ever really had a strong state. Whoever was in charge, you probably have similar sorts of issues going on. So we want to, you know, we'd like to see order, but there never will be. There's too much going on at the local level to make that possible. So what you hope for, which is the problem all these groups have, is their own internal conflicts and dissension. If you again look back at most militia-based wars, a very good example is Algeria, where the Algerian Islamist opposition was in a really strong position against a pretty discredited government, which was acting ruthlessly against them. But not only did they act ruthlessly in response, they kept on arguing amongst themselves. They kept on, and as soon as you get into situations where the leader is always looking behind to see who's after him, then you're politically weakened, and it turns into sort of your own little civil war. I mean, if you look at the Algerian civil war is a very interesting one because of the, you know, the age of the leadership went steadily down as one lot kept on knocking off the lot before till there were sort of almost teenagers in charge. So that's, I think, is their main vulnerability, is their internal factionalism. But for us, I think it is a problem that the bombing sites, as we know, has a limited effect. And even a group like ISIS, which presents itself as an army, therefore gives you more opportunities. The Taliban did in 2001. You can then defeat them possibly, but then they're dispersed and wait and make them come back, because the ideology and the beliefs are still there, and you're still finding it difficult to have governments that are able to reach out and take away the basis of their political claims.
So I wanted to ask a question about kind of state sponsorship or instrumental usage of these groups in these conflicts. So I think when we were talking about the kind of factionalism and how something can, they're kind of like armies, but they're less organized. I think this is definitely what we saw in the Ukraine conflict. And I was wondering how state sponsorship of certain militias can play into that. Is it inherently destabilizing, or is there a potential for instrumental usage of these kinds of militias?
Well, the state sponsorship is an important issue. You know, one of the ways that we went wrong, say in Vietnam, was in the belief that state sponsorship was everything. So that therefore we didn't appreciate the indigenous sources of dissent and radicalization. The problem for the state, you've got to look at the problem for the state sponsors, in the just because they've sponsored it doesn't mean to say they always control it. And I think that partly is the problem that Russia has faced in East Ukraine. So, without giving a whole potted history of the conflict in Ukraine, what Russia, I think, was trying to do was to sponsor a counter-revolution to the revolution that had taken place in February 2014 in Kiev. And they assumed a level of popular dissatisfaction amongst the Russian-speaking population in the East that would provide the basis for it. But it turned out they were wrong. They just hadn't got it right. So instead, as that sort of failed to take root, in March, April 2014, you had sort of local militants go on with the sort of famous little green men, which is basically Russian special forces, seizing administrative buildings, setting up roadblocks, establishing control over particular areas. And they, with the Ukrainian army in a mess, they did quite well at that until the Ukrainians sorted themselves out, started to push them back, at which point the Russians intervened more with more regular forces until they consolidated an area and they pulled back again. So what you were left, really from September 2014, is a militia, is local militias. The composition of these local militias is intriguing. I haven't seen any really good studies of their makeup, but it's pretty clear that they do involve some local people, but they involve adventurers and chancers, Chechens, as well as some Russian nationalists, as well as some special forces. And some of the features we saw of militias in Bosnia reappeared. The crime in particular. Money short, guys standing at street corners with guns, they extort. There's trafficking, they need to get guns, the smuggling routes. Some of these will then go back into Russia. The local guys suddenly get irritated with the outsiders are giving them orders and telling them what to do, which is a problem that you see with ISIS as well. So they start fighting, having scraps with each other. But I don't want to exaggerate all of that, but all of those pathologies are present. And the other one is the artillery shelling tends to have a clear relationship with the amount of alcohol that's imbibed as well. There's, never underestimate the importance of these factors as well. So the problem for Russia is, having created these militias, it really finds it very difficult to control them. And one of the signs that Russia is trying, I think, to get out of East Ukraine, or to limit its liabilities there, is it's replaced the leadership. Now and so you're starting to see the separatist leaders talk about betrayal, and this isn't what we expected. We want to be still part of Ukraine. We want to be part of Russia, or independent ourselves. So things that they will say have been indicate that even though Russia sponsored them, Russia doesn't quite control them. And I think that's actually going to be one of the challenges of winding the thing down, is seeing if these groups can be controlled. And they may just go just go into petty crime. But if they wanted to make a stand against being ruled from Kiev in some way again, whatever the new constitution may be, it could be difficult. So, it's kind of the same basic point, is that these groups develop an independent agenda that doesn't necessarily coincide with the agenda of their sponsors.
Do you see any value in decapitation strikes as a technique to promote fragmentation and dissension when a group like ISIS are leading to an ISIS led by teenagers, to relate to the Algeria example?
Not necessarily. I mean, a good example of that is Hamas, where the Israelis pursued a decapitation strategy to the point that Hamas got a really accomplished leader. You know, if you're going to... First, I think, you know, there's a general problem with decapitation strategy, which is, if you ever think you can do political deals, you've got to have somebody you can do a political deal with. And you may dislike intensely the leader that you have at the moment, but you can't assume that what will follow will be better, because, as in the case, I think it's true also of ISIS as well. Once the following decapitation can be better, or just more skilled, more strategically astute, and also, having seen what happened to their predecessors, they tend to be a little bit more careful. So, where I think, you know, the sort of the Israeli examples which show targeted killing can make a difference is if you're taking out sort of the officer corps, the NGO, the NCO, not commissioner officer, equivalent, the bomb makers or the engineers, or those sort of characters, and you do it on a very regular basis. In that sense, Hamas was weak, but not by. But I think decapitation itself doesn't necessarily kill off the organisation, and it may not make things worse. So, you know, what difference in the end is the killing of Osama bin Laden done? It was very important politically in the US, but it was a spent force in many respects by the time it happened. And in bizarre ways, Al-Qaeda now appears almost modern compared with ISIS. So it's not a surefire way of success.
Thank you for your remarks and presentation. Your comments lead me to believe that one of our real strategic vulnerabilities for the United States, or really any Western democracy, is that we are vulnerable to a strategy of exhaustion. Now, maybe not in the Hans Delper construct, but as far as political exhaustion. And we have, when you're trying to devise a strategy, I think we fail to recognize that since most of these wars none of these wars are existential for us, but they are for the other side, we're vulnerable to that. And so I wonder if you have any suggestions for how to construct strategies taking that into account. The second point I think you made that's very important is that both in Afghanistan and Iraq and almost every conflict we are in, we so vilify the enemy that we never really seek out a political opponent with which to deal and to have a political solution to the problem. And almost every enemy that we faced, whether it's Assad in Syria, you know, every enemy, we will not deal with them because of our ideological predisposition. But I wonder if you could comment on how to develop a strategy to overcome that vulnerability to exhaustion.
Yeah, I mean, I just published an article on Ukraine called Ukraine in the Art of Exhaustion. But part of that argument was, again, it goes back to my starting point about looking at decisive battles and so on. There's lots of strategic writing about how to win in the first few days, and knockout blows and surprise attacks. But actually, most wars don't end like that. They try, you know, somebody may try, but they find themselves with the enemy still there the next day, regrouping, trying to sort things out, and you're stuck in some longer campaign. And those with the greatest stake in the conflict can often endure more than those who don't, which is why I think the Ukrainians, despite their weakness, are in a stronger position now than the Russians. It's not going to work for them. So I think you're right that if you're dealing with an intervening power, then the best strategy is to just hang in there, until they get tired and popular opinion turns against it and it all seems futile and rubbish. We've seen it happen a number of times. How do you avoid that? You avoid it if you've got a government that you can work with. We had in Vietnam a government that was changing every few weeks at times. There was one coup after another.
We don't change.
Well, we encouraged the process to start with, and then it never stopped. So, first it meant that the South Vietnamese army was ridden with politics, because anybody who looked like they were being too successful was seen as a threat to whoever happened to be president at the time. And you know, there was nobody available. And eventually, Tew did establish himself for a bit longer, but it was, you know, a real problem, and it undermined the effectiveness of the fighting force. So the only way you can get out of these situations, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam or wherever, is by this is the ideal type that's always put forward, is by having a strong government that you can say you've left in charge, preferably democratic, but that may be putting too much of the demand on them, but strong government, and their own security forces. So we always spend lots of time training and so on. And if you want to look at why our counterinsurgency policies fail, is that we constantly find it difficult to develop the security forces that can take over when we leave. You know, we see it in Afghanistan at the moment. You know, in Iraq, something was done with the Iraqi army, but the Iraqi police forces were extensions of the militias at times. Didn't pay them very much, and unsurprisingly they were corrupt. So unless you can do that, you'll lose in the end. But if you have got a government you can work with or can put in place, then you've got a chance. You know, we thought Karzai was such a person. Turns out maybe he wasn't. Or, you know, over time, it just wasn't working well. You know, in different circumstances, he might have done better. And that's why, you know, the British in the end could deal with the IRA and all that, because we were the government. Put pressure on the local boss, but eventually we weren't going to be pushed out of our own country. And I think that's a mistake. Insurgents, if you look at Hezbollah, which is the most impressive strategically of all these groups, where they worked at the Israelis was in Israel places, they say like southern Lebanon, where a lot of Israelis felt they were unwise to be. And they ambushes and they played the Israeli media well, and the local leadership. Southern Lebanese army was not really that strong, couldn't cope out with Israel. So the Israelis left eventually. Now Hamas, which have always sort of tried to take its cues from Hezbollah, thought, this shows that you can put pressure on the Israelis. But if you take your campaign into Israel proper, to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa, where the Israelis feel they've got no choice but to be, then it doesn't work, because the government will fight back. Or Bin Laden can notice that the Americans scuttle away from Lebanon or Somalia and think, that shows the Americans are cowards. Let's hit them in New York and Washington. Well, it doesn't work like that, because when you hit them in New York and Washington, that's the American element. So the politics is important, and if you've got a government that is determined to fight back, you can fight back. So government's got no choice but to do so. Second part of the question. I mean, there are these big debates about negotiating with terrorists and so on. My point about them is not that it's wrong in principle, sometimes you have to, but there's no point unless they can deliver. And part of my argument is a lot of these groups just can't deliver. I think there's a problem for American foreign policy of making a conversation almost an important political act in itself. So if you know, even talking to the Iranians, I think it sounds a slightly different problem, but even talking to the Iranians somehow was legitimizing. Actually, they've already got legitimacy. The question is the content of the conversation, whether they can give you anything you want, whether there are deals to be done. You could make a perfectly good case that there are deals to be done with the Iranians in the current situation. I think Assad is different because just what he's done, but he's no longer in charge of his own country. He's in charge of one faction. The problem with peace in Syria is I don't see a peace as long as Assad looks like staying in power. But that's a problem of the peace deal itself rather than the principle of the conversation. Yeah.
Sorry for being late. Thanks for the talk. So, weaved into your conversation has been, we can call it information, strategic communication, whatever you want to call it. You spoke about effectively the power of diplomacy and military efforts. If we look at the four letters of DIME, the D, the M, and the E are all dependent on I. There's no diplomacy without the information aspect. Otherwise, it's closed door, nothing happens, nobody knows. And military power is almost worthless if nobody knows that you have military power, right? So, in the context in which you're talking about, there's ideology, there's the communication, Hezbollah, the example that you just gave, Hamas, and Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden attacking the homeland. Those are all invocations of informational public opinion. Public opinion matters in this exercise, and how do you mobilize and engage that? It's through these information activities and being smart communicators. I'm curious, in this different construct of international security, international politics, where would you put the ability to inform and communicate? Because again, I note that in your talk, it was just sort of slid in on the side, on the margins. You know, ideology is part of this public opinion. It's mobilizing the masses and combining them. So I'm just wondering, what advice do you have? Where are we going on this?
I think there's a difficulty. The difficulty is it's, for all the reasons you give, it's quite clear how people construct reality, how they think about it. You know, narrative is sort of the in-word, matter a lot. And that the way that conflict has come to be presented, the stories that are told about it, is what makes the difference. And therefore that argues that if only you could change the narratives, then you could move great chunks of opinion to your side. That's what hearts and minds is about. The narrative is about who's going to win, what will happen if they win, and so on. But it turns out it's very difficult to do that. And there's lots of interesting work that's been done. Looking at public information campaigns in Iran and Afghanistan and so on, Iraq and Afghanistan. And there's a number of problems. The most important is it doesn't work unless it fits in with the life experiences of the people you're trying to influence. And there's no point in saying that we take care and look after you if the wedding party in the village next door has just been bombed, or that Saddam was a vicious bastard, but well, look at these pictures from Abu Ghraib. You know, it's the information war is easily lost in those respects. And secondly, it's got to be leading somewhere. So one of the problems in most in a lot of these situations is that the local bosses, wherever they come, wherever they're from, shape people's lives. And unless you're informed of that, then it's not going to mean very much to the local population. A lot of narratives actually are not these sort of grand strategic meta-narratives or whatever, but they're quite specific about particular things. And they relate to how people live their lives. So the attempts to sort of have sort of precision information bombs locked into people's minds, so one says, oh gosh, I never saw the world like that before. The Americans are really great, and these people I've been supporting are really horrible. But it's just not going to work like that. It doesn't happen. It's slow grind of thinking all the time about how people perceive what you're doing and what matters to them, and seeing how you convert it. But it's a very slow process. And it's true, military operation, military deployment, the people don't know about and haven't got a chance to think about and contemplate what it might be. It may be meaningless. So it's not that it's unimportant, but it's very hard to do. And you can see that with the Russians. Everybody's talking about the brilliance of Russian hybrid warfare and Russian information operations, which essentially come down to lying through your teeth. People know. There's no evidence whatsoever that outside of Russia, where the media is more controlled, that this clever information manipulation has any effect other than to make people distrust anything the Russians say, even if they've told the truth about people in some part of the media. And you've seen that with Syria. I mean, by trying to be so clever in saying, first saying, well, we're going to attack ISIS targets, and then the next, they say, well, really anybody who's challenging Assad is a terrorist. People know that there are differences, and so they're just assembling again. So Russian information strategy, which is sort of a crude version of what you would hear from around the Bush administration in 2002-3, so when they were quite cocky about their ability. You say it's a fact, truthiness, of that. But the Russians are following a similar sort of approach. If they say black is white, but somehow that will affect people's perception. So that's why they get themselves in the mess with MH17. The Americans terribly blow up a hospital, but they say, we did something terrible, it's awful, we got it wrong. And people then start to adjust, and they're cross with the Americans. But when they're dealing with it, the Russians say, nothing to do with us when this airliner goes down. And they're still arguing about it over a year later. The Dutch report. It's clear that this was a Russian anti-air missile that knocked down the airliner, and all the other attempted how do we blame the Ukrainian theory dissolved from the temple. So I think the danger with the information warfare type of argument is not that it's unimportant, it's terribly important, but it exaggerates our ability to manipulate the way other people think. And in the end, if it's not relating to actual life experiences of the people that we're trying to influence, it isn't going to work. So right to the back.
So I'll give a little context, but I'll just ask the question up front and then come back to it. Real quick, so there's a lot of literature around counterinsurgency. One of the big things like when you're fighting a population-centric counterinsurgency, obviously the key terrain is populace. So how do you do that? One of the best ways to do that is provide security. So we make those assumptions and we say those are right. My question is, here's the question is, are we missing a variable right now between those two? It's when the goal of providing security actually can have a negative effect on bringing support of the populace. Here's the context. So if you look at Afghanistan, village stability operations, three lines of operation are security, governance, and development. And so, technically you can't have governance and development if you don't have security. So seemingly, we have a good strategy with the DSO. Now, obviously the rule of law is quite complicated in Afghanistan. So if we have individuals working with the people, and you have people, you're trying to win the populace for their support, they're coming to you, American soldiers, asking you for their support, for you to protect them, because they are experiencing political violence and suffering from the security forces that we're trying to build, right? So that goes back to my question. We're the U.S. military, policy, we're very quick to talk about how important security is. But when we saw at a strategic level, it all makes sense in its theory, it works, but at a tactical level, when the men and women who do certain actions to protect these people, $1 billion at a time for, an adage, but then are reprimanded for providing, putting the support of the populace, but they're reprimanded for counseling or taking activities right against the security forces. So, going back to my question, when those two are competing mechanisms, are we missing something? What's missing?
Well, I think you're sort of re-describing one of the points I was trying to make earlier. People live within particular power structures, and these power structures are often perceived as being oppressive. And if you're presenting your counterinsurgency as a way of making life better, then part of your challenge is the obvious enemy, but the obvious enemy is exploiting the grievances about the local power structure. And so every time you just try to side with the people, you're going to upset somebody. I mean, upsetting somebody is going to be part of the friendly state you're trying to support. So that's the political dilemma. It was very clear in Vietnam when the original safe havens and so on. The counter-insurgency strategy of the mid-60s kept on faltering on the fact that the strategic hamlets and so on, the local power structure just carried on, and people didn't feel any more secure or better off. On the other hand, if you challenge them more directly, then you really are playing more of a colonial role. You're taking responsibility for government away from locals. It's a dilemma, and that's why I keep on coming back to the problem of whether or not you've got somebody you can work with who has real political authenticity. And they may not be, liberal Democrat, but at least they'll have a following. You understand how the system works and how people can be persuaded. So, a country that needs us to help sort them out is not one that is going to be, has to be turned around. And insurgency and war are very difficult times to turn these places around. Where you can be successful is in situations like Bosnia or what is a good example, or Kosovo. Not that you can turn these into get the great liberal democracies, but the local leadership is quite a part of the homogenous population. They're prepared to work with you, and you're not actually fighting all the time. You have that. There is a degree of security. Then you've got a chance to help. The classic dilemma of counterinsurgency when you're in somebody else's country, that either you've got to take over the local power structure and make it something different, in which case you really are the colonialist, and you've got to be prepared to see it through, or you're still working with them, and as soon as you get fed up and back off, then the problems will return. That's the dilemma. I don't think there's an easy way out, other than where you know there's going to be a vacuum, as there was in Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003, being properly prepared for it, which we were. Excusably, I think, in Afghanistan, less excusably in Iraq. Anybody else?
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sure you've got many challenge points.
Oh, yeah.
There's only one that has a skull and a mortarboard on it.
Oh, that's great.
So it's the security studies challenge point. So thank you very much for coming again.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.